Chapter 47. Pastor Rice gave Michelle's eulogy, and his daughter sang after he finished. It was beautiful. There's something very different about a eulogy when the person giving it knew and loved the person. Now, Pastor Rice is a genuine person anyhow, but his words rang especially true and powerful as he spoke over our beloved Michelle. It had rained off and on all day, but as he spoke, the storm picked up and it really started to come down hard. In the middle of his eulogy, there was a thunderous crash, like something huge being torn apart. And the power went out and dim emergency lighting lit the building. Pastor Rice didn't stumble over a single syllable. Now, you'd have thought he planned it that way if you didn't know better. Now, immediately, as soon as it happened, I thought of the earthquake that occurred at Calvary as Jesus' spirit left his body and he said, "It is finished." That was the first thing that came to my mind. As Pastor Rice spoke, the girls started weeping as they sat to my left in the front row. I was crying silently, trying to hold it together. My brother Jeremy, God bless him, he came and sat in the aisle next to me because I was on the end of the row. There was nowhere to sit next to me. And sat in the floor, sat in the aisle next, sat right there on the floor next to me. He held my hand. And brother, my tears flowed freely. We have a beautiful picture from our wedding. The one I described earlier with the 3 rays of light falling between us onto the book that held our holy vows. That picture still rests on the wall above our bed, and it was on a stand next to Michelle at the funeral. And in the dim emergency lighting, those 3 rays of light appeared to be glowing, and they were probably the brightest thing in the room. After Pastor Rice finished the eulogy, his daughter sang beautifully. They really did. They knew and loved Michelle too. And the storm abated while they sang. As the service came to a close, the doors leading outside were opened, and clear, bright sunshine filled the room. I swear. Heaven just like that. It's beautiful. You open that door, just rays of light just poured in. It's beautiful right after that storm. Big storm too. I'll be the last to leave. And I took my time saying goodbye to my wife's mortal shell that had carried her on earth for 48 years. That I'd held, loved, and laughed and cried with. When Michelle started chemo, she'd asked for a handkerchief of mine to carry with her throughout her treatments. Something to keep with her, you know. And she kept it with her throughout her treatments. And I placed that handkerchief in her hand, along with a private note. And she was beautiful, and she didn't look sick anymore. She was always beautiful to me anyhow. I took my time, and the gentleman from the funeral home waited patiently the entire time. When I was ready, in the tradition of the old ways, I lowered the casket lid myself, and I screwed it shut with my own hands. Trey, Corey, and Nick, and Michelle's nephews, Kyle and Gary, were pallbearers. And together we carried her casket to the hearse, and we drove in procession to the cemetery with bright sunlight illuminating our path. I remember being moved at how perfect strangers all pulled to the side of the road as we passed. Now, I'd always done so myself, but until that very moment, I never realized just how meaningful that was. And I also learned that the loud crash we heard during the eulogy was the roof a couple buildings down from us being torn off at the height of the storm. And nobody was hurt, but it took a transformer down with it, thus knocking out the power. Now, for a moment, right, the earth had mourned with us at Michelle's funeral. And it left damage behind in its wake, followed by bright rays of hope. We gathered at an outdoor committal chapel at the cemetery, and Pastor Rice spoke a few words, and then I spoke a few myself, recounting John 14, 1 through 3, and how the Holy Spirit had comforted us on the day of Michelle's passing. Now, in the tradition and customs of the cemetery and of Michelle's church, we then followed Pastor Rice back at the house of worship where he ministered, where the good people at Community Harvest Tabernacle fed us kindly and generously. Now, in our family tradition, the family prepares the gravesite with shovel and mattock, right? We don't have no buddy come and do that. We do that. So we prepare the gravesite with shovel and mattock, if appropriate, or if it's above the floodplain, you're going to put a marble crypt, marble and cement for the crypt. And we do everything, and then we lower our loved ones ourselves into the earth. We do that. We don't have nobody else do this stuff. We do it, and everybody passes the shovel. For real, that's how we do it. Now that probably sounds really strange to a lot of people, but once you do it, you'll understand. But here we follow the local customs, and the funeral home staff interred my wife's casket into a vault, which they then sealed and buried while we ate with Pastor Rice and members of his congregation. Now, just as soon as I could decently do so, I started saying my farewells so I could make my way back to the cemetery. My Aunt Lynn, bless her heart, she traveled down from Cincinnati to attend the funeral. I gave her a great big hug, and I thanked her for coming. I hadn't expected her to come, but it meant a whole lot to me that she did. Aunt Lynn had also attended the wedding, and she knew exactly what I was doing and where I was headed. See, Aunt Lynn had lost her husband Scott to cancer years before, and she saw right through me with X-ray vision empathy. Like, couldn't hide it. Could not that I was trying to hide it from anybody. I didn't have to do nothing. She knew exactly where I was going. She's a beautiful human being, as was Uncle Scott. And their love deserves a book of its own. And just like my parents were for me, Aunt Lynn and Uncle Scott, they were a wonderful example of how to love people properly. And I'd attended Uncle Scott's funeral when he had passed years before, and Man, I'm going to tell you what, I learned a powerful lesson that day. I saw all the people there and heard all the wonderful, amazing things they had to say about Uncle Scott that I never even knew he did. I didn't know he did all that. I had no idea. I just knew he was a good man, somebody I knew was a good man. I didn't know everybody knew him as a good man. And I learned a powerful lesson that day. And the lesson was this: the sum of consistent kindness over a lifetime is something far greater than what you probably imagine. So I said my goodbyes, and I thanked everyone again, and then I made my way to the cemetery with Trey and Corey and then Angie, Corey's girlfriend at the time. And at the gravesite, I was dismayed at just how rough the earth looked. Big chunks of dirt and rocks visible. And I immediately started breaking it all up by hand and removing all the rocks. It was dirty, sweaty work. I didn't have any tools with me, not that kind of tool. But it felt good and it felt right. Like part of those old traditions calling out to me, And the boys and Angie helped too. And by the end of the night, we replaced the spray of flowers on a much improved gravesite. And the next day I would return with proper tools. But for now I was satisfied. It looked loved, as it should to anyone and everyone who sees it. And a couple years later, I'm still not done with it. And never will be. For as long as I'm alive, it will always look loved, as it should.